So, folks, we've got a margarita. We've got Matt Walsh's new documentary, The Real History of Slavery, queued up. And we have the will and the passion to get a little bit
Google debunkers
about it. So, it's time. We're going to find out exactly how good Matt Walsh is at making an argument about the real history of slavery. And, well, I, for one, am not going to hold my breath. Let's dive into it, shall we? And I am going to be a petty bitch about everything. I just to be upfront, I am going to be petty as hell. Because I think a white nationalist, an open white nationalist, teaching the real history of slavery is odious and terrible and can only end in disaster. So let's take a look, shall we?
For more than half a century, anti-American propagandists have waged a demoralization campaign against us. Generations of...
Okay, so just to have a problem already right off the bat, anti-American woke moralists have been waging a war against America to what end, exactly?
Americans have been force-fed lies designed to beat us into a state of submission and self-loathing.
Okay, so the big scary anti-American faction wants the patriotic Americans to be self-hating. They want self-hating patriots. Okay?
We've been taught to hate ourselves, to hate the West.
Uh-huh. To hate the West? All right. Interesting point. Let's elaborate on that a little bit more. I can't wait to dig in. What does it mean to hate a cardinal direction? What does that mean exactly?
And to hate the figures, mostly white, mostly male, who built America. We're all...
Well, the figures as recorded in a lot of mainstream history are predominantly white and male, but part of the nature of more recent histories is revisiting those assumptions and digging into, like, what were other people doing? Like, for example, one of the first person to ever write functional computer code did so before mechanical computers were a thing, you know? And she was a woman, and her contributions to mathematics and to the creation of software itself were largely overlooked until more recently, when folks began like re-examining historical sources. Yeah, Ada Lovelace. Yeah, Miss Ada Lovelace. The she literally had like the nickname like the Mistress of Mathematics or something like that. Yeah, Ada Lovelace. Wonderful figure in history. Very much overlooked at the time. Because again, if you look back at history, oftentimes women were not afforded the agency to do something like, say, get a patent. So their husbands would then go get a patent, and their husbands would be recorded as like the inventor of said thing because they couldn't just go get one themselves. Right? Like this is just one small example of how history often doesn't tell a complete story unless you look at a much wider picture of what was happening and interrogate like the different characters of a given narrative. You know? Let's keep going though. It is interesting though to be like the people mostly white, mostly male, and then you use a picture right here of segregation. And again, I would just like to point out, during Jim Crow segregation, black women helped take us to the moon. You like a lot of these things are not that old, and we can see just relatively recently the contributions of people who are not just straight white men. Which isn't to say, by the way, that white men haven't contributed positively to the history of America. There are plenty of swell white guys. It's true. Some white men, pretty cool. It's just that maybe we don't need to put on a pedestal the same white men that were doing like active genocides, you know? Like Maybe we don't need to put Colonel Custer on a pedestal for participating in a massive act of genocide. Maybe we don't need to do that. So, I think we can maybe tell the difference between someone who made society better and someone who actively participated in an ongoing suppression of people being genocided. Just as like an example.
Familiar with their narrative? America is uniquely evil because of racism, slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and so on. They've waged intellectual warfare against our founding fathers and national heroes. They desecrated their reputations, tore down their statues.
Oh, okay, but the guys you're showing statues of getting pulled down, you do know that they fought for not the United States of America, right? We're less than a minute into this video, and he's like, they desecrated our history. They didn't desecrate our history. To be completely frank with you, the Confederacy was not us. The Confederacy is not the United States of America, pretty explicitly. Like, these are statues commemorating traitors to the Republic. They have no place in America. We should not be honoring racists and rapists and people who killed hundreds of thousands of our countrymen. But it's, again, not surprising that Matt Walsh feels very strongly about the Confederacy, considering that he has, in the past, worn, shirts with the Confederate battle flag on them and, is an open white nationalist. Can I just pull up a little flag here while doing some
Google debunkers?
There we go. Nice. Yeah, here's just a little image of Matt Walsh back when he was a radio shock jock on the Matt and Crank program. You can see him in the background of the video. This has a little bit of a stylized overlay on it, but you can very clearly see here the Confederate flag on his shirt. Because, again, he's a white nationalist. By the way, during that program, he also oversaw Nazi diaper baby wrestling. It's very weird, but he refereed two grown men in diapers wrestling each other, and one of the grown men appears to have a swastika drawn on his back. It's very weird. It's very, very weird. But look at him all grown up now. Surrounded by so many old books he will never read. So much knowledge available to him that he actively spits upon every single time he opens his mouth.
Their rewriting of history is such flagrant propaganda that would make Pravda blush. That doesn't mean that it's not pervasive or successful. One professor from the University of Wisconsin spent 11 years administering historical literacy tests to his students. He discovered that they overwhelmingly believed that slavery began in the U.S., was almost exclusively an American phenomenon. A view shared.
Wait, that's interesting. The College Fix, breaking campus news, launching media careers. Hey, you know what? Let's take a look. Let's find that article real quick. And I don't even need the Google debunk for this.
Google debunkers.
Because I did watch a couple minutes of this prior to, showing it to you guys. Here's the article. Look at that. We found it. Most college students think America invented slavery, Professor finds. Well, that's really interesting. Let's find out more. For 11 years, Professor Duke Pesta gave Professor Duke Pesta sounds like a character from Bob's Burgers, and I don't know how to elaborate on that to any greater degree. Gave quizzes to his students at the beginning of the school year to test their knowledge on basic facts about American history and Western culture. The most surprising result from his 11-year experiment? Students' overwhelming belief that slavery began in the United States and was almost exclusively an American phenomenon, he said. Most of my students could not tell me anything meaningful about slavery outside of America, Pesta told the College Fix. They were convinced that slavery was an American problem that more or less ended with the Civil War, and they were very fuzzy about the history of slavery prior to the colonial era. Their entire education about slavery was confined to America. Pesta, currently an associate professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, has taught the gamut of Western literature. And I just want to pause here to point out, This guy's not teaching American history. He's not teaching like social studies. He's teaching he's teaching literature. The quizzes were relatively unrelated to what he was teaching about, right? Let's just continue reading. The origin of these quizzes, which Pesta calls cultural literacy markers, was his increasing discomfort with gaps in his students' foundational knowledge. They came to college without the basic rudiments of American history or Western culture, and their reading level was pretty low, Pesta told The Fix. Before even distributing the syllabus for his courses, Pesta administered his short quizzes with basic questions about American history, economics, and Western culture. For instance, the questions asked students to circle which 3 historical figures was a president of the United States, or to name 3 slave-holding countries over the last 2,000 years, or define capitalism and socialism in 1 sentence each. Often, more students connected Thomas Jefferson to slavery than could identify him as president, according to Pesta. On one quiz, 29 out of 32 students responding knew that Jefferson owned slaves, but only 3 of the 32 correctly identified him as president. Interestingly, more students, 6 of 32, actually believed Ben Franklin had been president. Which is, that's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. Not gonna lie. But I am going to perhaps throw out here a few caveats to all of this, which is that, one, you may have noticed by now, this is not a scientific study. This is a professor noticing a thing. This is not, in fact, him conducting an experiment. This is not him, in fact, making any kind of real, academic stab at studying this phenomenon. This is his own perspective. Now, interestingly, towards the end of this, as we now see on campus, Pesta said, social justice warriors are arguing that even reading the great books of Western culture is at best a microaggression, and at worst an insidious form of cultural imperialism and indoctrination. Pesta, an outspoken critic of Common Core, said he believes that these attitudes will become more pronounced moving forward, due to Common Core architect David Coleman's rewrite of advanced placement American and European history standards. Pesta argues that Coleman, now president of the College Board, has further politicized the teaching of history, reducing the story of Western culture to little more than a litany of crimes, exploitations, and genocides, while simultaneously whitewashing the history of ideologies like socialism and communism. So, obviously, I'm kind of curious. Who's this Jimmy Pesto guy? Sorry, who's this Duke Pesta guy? Who is this strange, mysterious figure? Let's find out. Let's do some Google debunking. Duke Pesta. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, it's Duke Pesta, and is that Glenn Beck? Oh, that's so interesting. That's such an interesting phenomenon, isn't it?
From January 6th.
From January 6th? Yeah, Jimmy Pesto from Jan 6th, indeed. Let's just I'm really curious. He does something called the Freedom Project. You might notice his microphone there, Freedom Project. Let's take a look at one of the events that he was holding back in 2023. Oh, what's this? Okay, all right. We're on Reddit. Extreme Sex Ed, CRT, and Social Emotional Learning in Schools, and How to Fight Back. Dr. Duke Pesta is director of Freedom Project Academy, host of the Dr. Duke Show podcast, and a tenured professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. He's one of America's foremost authorities on the dangers of CRT, which stands for critical race theory, in case folks don't know. Common Core, and the federal takeover of education, having delivered over 1,500 talks in 48 states. He has testified about educational issues in 22 states, and his collective videos and presentations top more than 150 million views online. Much of his work is available at freedomproject.com. That's so interesting. Now, for those of you who don't understand some of the buzzwords being thrown around here, critical race theory is simply the idea that one should evaluate the perspective of history through multiple lenses. Like, how does history look when evaluated through the lens of an African American, for example? It turns out that you need to have a critical understanding of these differences in the effects of these narratives, because it turns out history as a dominant narrative that many of us learned in our public education is more nuanced than what we were initially taught. There are numerous different types and types of narratives and stories. For example, the 1619 Project was about the history of folks who were brought here against their will, slaves from Africa, and the descendants thereof, right? And that effort was done in order to expand education, not to narrow it down to simply one dominant perspective. It was there to expand our understanding of history. When we're talking about social emotional learning, what is that? What does that actually do? Social emotional learning is teaching children how to regulate themselves. So instead of, for example, a bunch of kids bullying one another in order to make themselves feel good, instead you give them appropriate social emotional tools so that they don't have to bully, so that they can live work in harmony with their peers. And instead of, bullying someone for being neurodivergent or gay or trans or whatever, instead everyone can kind of handle their own shit. The goal of social emotional learning is to be able to handle your shit in a healthy way. If I were to simplify it down, right? It's the implementation of the golden rule: treat others the way you want to be treated, but alongside actual usable tools to calm down your, nervous system. Because when kids are small, they don't know to take deep breaths. When kids are small, they don't know how to directly communicate what they want. That needs to be taught. These are skills that are not just inherent to children or inherent to growing up. A lot of people wind up fully grown, never having learned these skills. It took until I was in my late 20s to learn, hey, actually, deep breathing isn't just bullshit. It actually activates different parts of your brain so that you can calm down. It is not, in fact, horseshit that actually can help regulate your nervous system. And instead, what social emotional learning does is it teaches kids that at the beginning, when they need the most help calming down their nervous systems. What a lot of conservatives complain about with social emotional learning is that, like, oh, you're teaching them how to be weak and little pansy-ass, lily-livered punks. They're not going to learn how to be tough like I did. But, like, what you're actually doing is allowing them to be able to communicate their feelings openly, honestly, and, not be dicks to one another. I know this might be wild, but being a dick is a learned activity. Being an asshole is taught. And in many cases, it's beaten into kids, either by their peers or their adults. And so when you implement this as a school-wide thing, it turns out you can actually have a group of kids that don't learn to be dicks and instead learn to treat each other with respect and decency. That's why social emotional learning is taught in schools. And as for extreme sex ed, again, that's not I'm sorry, the left is not pushing for extreme sex ed in schools. What is typically classified as extreme sex ed is the idea that is often poorly understood that, hey, sex ed needs to be introduced from the time kids get into school and to the time that they leave school. And what that means is in preschool, they have a form of sex ed, and in high school, they have a form of sex ed. But what that looks like in preschool is very different from what that looks like in high school. The same way a baby looks very different from a high schooler, so too does the curriculum around this topic. For a preschooler or a kindergartner, sex ed is just, you learn what the different parts of your body is called, and you learn, hey, this is your no-no zone. People should not be touching your no-no zone. But when conservatives hear sex ed for preschoolers, they think you're going to be showing the preschoolers pornography. And that's not how that works at all. And obviously, as kids get older, the curriculum changes. Just as the curriculum for like social studies is not the same from kindergarten
Extreme
to 5th grade.
Sex Ed is just sex ed from the 90s, taught to you by Tony Hawk.
God, that would be a really successful in-class video, though. Tony Hawk doing like some sick wheelies and then giving you the straight dope. Hell yeah. But the thing is, this is important because it keeps children safe. And if you teach kids about the names of their body parts and what is and is not appropriate interaction with those body parts, then it allows them to communicate with a trusted adult that someone is violating that space, which in turn allows a community to be alerted that there is a predator or that there is something wrong. It allows us to keep our kids safe. It allows us to make sure that kids are safe with one another, that there's no one predating on the kids. Yeah, the sex ed is to protect the children. I think a lot of conservatives just don't get that. The education is literally to stop the predation on kids. But this guy is very much against all of that and has made it his life's mission to fight all of that. So I just bring not to like slander his point here in this article from the College Fix. I know we've gone far afield here, but one, we have to understand where he's coming from here, and two, both things can be true. It can be true that this guy is conservative and opposes, children being educated properly and treating each other with respect, etc. And also our public education system can be failing kids. Now, I, of course, would argue that our public education system fails children largely because of stuff like No Child Left Behind and standardized testing, encouraging teachers to teach to arbitrary tests that are weighted for different kids to do better than other kids, in a sense that is kind of bullshit. And instead of getting the education that kids need, they're getting educated so that they can do better on tests, which is not the same thing, actually. I think both things can be true here. That being said, I think that Matt Walsh's takeaway from this is going to be very similar to Jimmy Pesto's takeaway, and Duke Pesto's take on it, okay? Which is essentially, these kids are all not being taught the real history because the woke social justice warriors are teaching them wrong and teaching them to hate America and the West. Like, I think that's the takeaway that's coming about here. And it's not, in fact, that the public education system is failing, which is the real cause, but rather their argument is that a nefarious group of actors has infiltrated the education system in order to teach children wrong as a way to undermine America as a country.
Slavery began in the U.S., was almost exclusively an American phenomenon. A view shared, by the way, with at least one United States senator who attended Harvard Law.
The United States didn't inherit slavery from anybody. We created it.
Despite almost total ignorance on the topic, one Washington Post poll...
Well, to be fair, America created its own brand of slavery. Is true of a lot of the places that adopted slavery. There are many different forms of slavery. And we're going to talk about a lot of them as we go through this, but America's slavery system was racialized and commodified and justified very differently than other forms of slavery in the past or even contemporaneously with American slavery.
Found that a 67% majority of the public says the legacy of slavery affects American society today.
That question every black person
That's true. It does.
gets, which is slavery was a long time ago. Why don't you get over it? How do you get over something that is as foundational to your society as anything can be foundational?
We've been told that the history of slavery is straightforward and uncontroversial. We've been told that black slaves were mostly captured by whites.
That's not a key component of the American slavery curriculum. Like, I gotta be honest, having gone. First of all, just to be clear, I have a degree in English literature, and I minored in medieval history. So not quite the same, but I have some grounding in how slavery was enacted in, medieval Europe and such like that. But I also went through the public education system and took college level courses in American history. And I can tell you that one of the parts that was not super deeply explained or elaborated on was how people in Africa were caught and enslaved. The basic premise that I was taught was that European explorers came and eventually came to down the coast of Africa, eventually realized that there was a slave trade going on amongst the African peoples, and began to partake in that slave trade, which created a massive financial incentive for slavery to take place in the mainland of Africa. We're gonna maybe get a little bit more into this as we go along, but that's kind of the gist of it. And of course, there were also, white pirate-like vessels that would show up and do slaving and stuff like that. That was also something that happened, but a lot of the enslavement actually happened between different African groups. But the reason it was happening was largely predicated on the economic exchange between European powers and African nations.
White colonists in the Americas.
It was never white people were all of the people who were doing the enslaving were white. That was never a key cornerstone of the education, just to be clear.
Americas routinely enslaved free black men, and that more black people were enslaved than whites. And we've been told that we're not allowed to question any of that. Well, enough is enough.
In America, yes, more black people were enslaved than white people. If we're talking about in the entire history of the institution or cultural practice of slavery, I have genuinely no idea. But let's hear what Matt Walsh has to say.
Launching a monthly series setting the record straight on various historical...
Well, slavery as we know it, Nates, was supercharged by capitalism. And this is something I want to get into a bit later in this video, but capitalism fundamentally changed a lot of the relationships that slavery had been up until that point understood as coming alongside of. And I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit more in a bit. Just know capitalism and slavery led to a very different kind of slavery.
Topics. We'll give you the facts that the propagandists and idiot school teachers have left out of the mainstream curriculum. And we'll start today by taking on one of the central claims of modern anti-American mythology.
Okay,
this
lay it on us.
Is the real history of slavery. Historians and political pundits spend a lot of time talking about the transatlantic slave trade, the 350-year period in which an estimated 12.5 million slaves were brought to the Americas. But what we don't learn in school is where those slaves actually went. Just under half of them.
No, I'm pretty sure a lot of people learn that slaves went to other countries besides the United States. You definitely learn that other countries were buying slaves in the Americas for the purposes of working on plantations like sugar and such like that. We did learn that not just Americans were buying slaves with the transatlantic slave trade. And I want to point that out largely because, a bulk of the slaves were sent to places like Brazil or the various islands in the Caribbean in order to be worked to death, oftentimes. But yes, the slave trade is called the transatlantic slave trade, not just because they were crossing the Atlantic to the United States, but because they were going a whole bunch of different places across the Atlantic.
An estimated 5.4 million went only to Brazil, and many more went to the Caribbean. 1.2 million went to Jamaica, more than 900,000 to St. Dominique, and 889,000 to Cuba. The grand total of slaves brought to the future United States was about half the number brought only to Cuba, 472,372, or 3% of the total. The ones who came to the 13 colonies were the lucky ones. In the context of global slavery,
I think saying something like that is deeply misleading. It's deeply misleading to say the ones sent to the United States were the lucky ones, because while, yes, conditions in Brazil in particular, or many of the Caribbean plantations, were objectively worse, it was still really bad to be enslaved in the United States. To me, it's kind of like saying you were lucky to go to, a slightly less bad concentration camp during World War II. It's like, well, I guess so, but like the suffering was still pretty great, and a huge number of people died.
getting put on a ship to New Orleans was really a best case scenario. If you think American slavery,
I mean, a best case scenario would be not getting enslaved.
Was bad, wait until you see what happened to the ones who didn't make it here. And we'll show you that over the course of this video.
Like, the part that bothers me, or one of the parts that bothers me, because there's
the ones who didn't make it here. And we'll show you that over the course of this video.
Like, the smug demeanor of this man, as if, like, he's getting one over on you, you know? I don't know. It seemed like if someone was being smug about this, talking about the Holocaust, you'd have a bunch of questions about their motivations here. Luckily, we don't have to have any questions about Matt Walsh's motivations because he's just openly a white nationalist. He's just openly embraced white supremacy and the idea that white people are inherently better than black people, right? Like, that's where he comes from here. It's not subtle. He's not trying to hide it.
Video. But first, we start with a West African country you've likely never heard of, the Kingdom of Dahomey. Now, Dahomey was not a peripheral player in the Atlantic slave trade. It was central to it. The kingdom's wealth, its military power, and its cultural splendor were built entirely on the systematic capture, sale, and export of human beings.
This is not entirely true. Now, Dahomey was a nation that was largely built upon military conquest. Essentially, they rose as a military power, and they expanded, and essentially, kind of like a version, like a Sparta type society. Like, a lot of their civilization was built around the concept of warfare, and they were early adopters of European weaponry. And so what wound up happening is that they had a very large standing army, which in some cases was pretty unusual in the case of like how they were able to organize their military. And Dahomey, again, early adopter of European weaponry. So they would be using and tended to prefer European rifles, mortars, etc. And they were quick to adapt and adopt to European tactics. And so they structured a lot of their militaristic society around which part of the military you were in. Are you on the left flank, the right flank, in the reserves, etc., right?
You could make a drinking game by taking all his arguments and applying them to Jeffrey Dahmer. Really, the people who were killed by Jeffrey were the lucky ones. He only ate them after they died.
True. I mean, his arguments are just terrible. Just absolutely terrible. When we are looking at the African slave trade, this map is pretty important. Okay? And you'll see why it's relevant to what we're talking about. This is a number of the large West African kingdoms at the time. And in the 1800s, a lot of these kingdoms were able to maintain themselves and maintain and grow their power by participating in the African slave trade, largely because by this point in time, several centuries had passed, and it turns out that a really easy way to get European weaponry and European wealth was to exchange slaves. And that in turn allowed you to maintain your kingdoms. And you can see here, Dahomey is actually fairly small. It was a fairly small but influential military outpost that Europeans quite liked. And due to the martial nature of Dahomey, essentially what they were doing and served as a large European military base from which folks could then explore or trade or exploit other people around them. When Matt Walsh is talking about like, oh well, they were made all of their wealth on slaves, that became true. It was not initially true. So initially, a lot of these different kingdoms would occasionally go to war with each other, would occasionally engage in empire building, etc. But their economies were largely directed internally, i.e., you wanted to have a lot of women in the household so that you could make stuff for other people around you to buy. And it was largely subsistence, and a lot of the excess wealth went to the upper ruling class, right? It was not a consumer economy necessarily. The introduction of capitalism and a colossal incentive to sell human beings, that changed things pretty fundamentally, not just for Dahomey, but also for the Ashanti, the Oyo, like a lot of these different kingdoms and communities had to change as a result of the advent of European contact. So when Matt Walsh is talking about like, oh, look at them, they all were making money off of the slave trade, that's because the Europeans brought with them a colossal desire for the slave trade. So the Portuguese were largely one of the group of people that sailed down the coast. And in 1419, they began trading slaves. And largely, this began out of a desire to set up a volcanic island that they had settled that had previously not had people on it. And they had turned it into a port. The Portuguese realized that they could have a really awesome sugar plantation there, but they couldn't convince other Portuguese people to go to that island. They realized that they could just buy slaves from the neighboring African kingdoms, and that then began the business model, in a sense, of the transatlantic slave trade. Because a bunch of folks learned about what was happening on that Portuguese island, which... when was that? I believe the first purchase was in 1419. So essentially, the Canary Islands set up to be a slave plantation. I might be wrong on that. Wait a minute. No, Porto Santo. There we go. Nailed it. I'm so sorry. My facts are getting a little mixed up. Luckily, I care about the factual nature of what I'm telling you more than Matt Walsh has ever cared about a fact in his life.
By the end of the kingdom, an estimated 1.9 million slaves came from West African coastline controlled by the Dahomey. The kingdom obtained its slaves by waging perpetual warfare upon its neighbors. In the 19th century, a Dahomeyan king named Gezo described the slave trade as the ruling principle of my people. It is the source of their glory and health. Their songs celebrate their victories, and the mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery. Now, in many cases, the Kingdom of Dahomey obtained these slaves by deploying an all-female military unit called the Dahomey Amazons. They were the chief slave catchers of the empire. The Amazons would raid nearby towns and return with large contingents of slaves, along with the heads of anyone who resisted. One missionary who visited the country in 1861 described some of Dahomey's soldiers as equipped with 3-foot-long straight razors, which they held two-handed, and which were supposedly capable of splitting a man into two halves. According to one historian, quote, when Amazons walked out of the palace, they were preceded by a slave girl carrying a bell. Sound told every male to get out of their path, retire a certain distance, and look the other way.
Fun fact, because I don't really trust this at all. I mean, I do think that the information he just shared is accurate, but the origins, I think the reason he is sharing this information is largely to say, look at them with their backwards ideas, with their violent women, etc., 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 you know? The Amazons that he's talking about initially got their start as essentially banner carriers for the king. It was a military tactic in order to make their numbers look much larger than they actually were. And what wound up happening is that over time, you know, conflict can boil over, unexpected things can happen, and these banner carriers wound up having to fight. And it turned out that these women were actually pretty great at fighting. And so the king formed an entirely female regiment, the Amazons, and formally brought them into the military command. And part of what Matt Walsh is doing here is also kind of primitivizing it, primitivizing this civilization, because one of the explicit reasons the Amazons were considered so deadly was largely because one of the sayings in Dahomey was that, you know, it would take a normal, like it would take a man 30 actions in order to load a traditional European rifle. For an Amazon, it just takes 7. So essentially, they were just way better at using guns. I think for obvious reasons, a conservative like Matt Walsh might take issue with that kind of rhetoric. But let's keep going.
If the men didn't get out of the way, they stood a very good chance of being split in half. The Dahomey Amazons ran roughshod over the region. An American missionary named Jacob Bauer discovered 18 depopulated towns over 60 miles near the territory of Dahomey. The death toll was massive. Gezo, the king we mentioned earlier, built a palace called the Singboji, which used human skulls for bricks and human blood as mortar.
Oh my God. How could anyone do that? How could anyone make, I don't know, some kind of cathedral out of bones? It sounds so barbaric. Who could do something like this? I mean, it's unprecedented, really, when you start thinking about it. Oh, wait, you mean a lot of people have done that? Oh, okay. That's interesting. You know, I would just be really interested in, like, more information about this, but what Matt Walsh is doing here is trying to freak them out. For those of you who have no idea what I just showed on screen, that is a famous chapel called the Skull Chapel. It is in Poland. It's a Catholic church, and it is built out of thousands of skulls and human skeletons.
His throne sat on the skulls of 4 enemy chiefs. Assuming you survived a Dahomey raid, which wasn't likely, and were taken captive, it was far preferable to be sold to Europeans than to remain in Dahomey. Slaves they couldn't sell or that they didn't want anymore were subjected to torture and public executions. That's because the Dahomeyans believed that they could communicate with the gods through human sacrifice.
Yeah, who'd ever believe in being able to communicate with their deity through the blood of an innocent sacrifice? Surely no Western culture would ever widely adopt that idea. Oh wait, you mean the biggest religion in the world also has that idea, and Matt Walsh professes to believe in it? Oh, okay, cool.
On average, they dispatched about 500 people a year. Roughly 10% were killed at the annual custom, a yearly mass slaughter. In 1893, the Sacramento Daily Union reported, quote, hundreds are annually put to death with the most savage tortures. They are
now, by the way, I do want to say, I'm not a fan of putting people to death or human sacrifice or torture. anything like that. I think that's bad. I think it's bad when Christians do it. I think it's bad when non-Christians do it. And I think maybe we should just put a whole stop to this human sacrifice thing and torture. Full stop. I don't think there's really a cause to do it. But Matt Walsh is talking about it as if other cultures, other belief systems don't do this. And it is also true that Dahomey did have a history of sacrificing people, and in particularly brutal ways. This is, however, not unique to Dahomey. This is something that many human cultures and civilizations have done across time. And we should understand that this is not uniquely evil to this civilization, but we should still recognize it as pretty evil, you know? It's pretty not great to build your entire society around slaughtering your enemies and then also doing ritualistic sacrifice of said enemies.
Dismembered limb by limb, they're tied to posts, and hounds are set to worry them to death. They are securely fastened to the ground near the nests of the ferocious ants of the country that attack them and tear their flesh bit by bit away. The spectacle of a still living man with his body half eaten by the ants.
I do want to ask, what does this have to do with slavery exactly? This, don't get me wrong, interesting aspects of this given culture, but also how does this play into slavery? Is it just American children aren't taught enough about Dahomey? I mean, I think it'd be great. I think it'd be great if kids learned more about different African cultures and civilizations. I actually think that should be something that people learn. There should be more classes about the history of different cultures and societies that have existed on Earth. I think that's actually a really great thing to call for. But something tells me that Matt Walsh isn't going to go into an in-depth examination of like palm oil production and the importance of palm oil production to many of the folks in West Africa. Something tells me he's not going to go into a lot of the aspects that dominated and shaped a lot of different cultures across Africa pre-European contact. Something tells me he's in fact doing this here to portray African peoples as a whole as primitive and barbaric and violent. And the thing that bothers me about that, in addition to all of the racism, which again is just heaped upon heaped upon heaped throughout this video at all times, what really gets to me on top of that is that it kills intellectual curiosity. It is a thought-terminating cliche, which is, by the way, what all bigotry is. All bigotry is an excuse to stop thinking at all. You know, it is an excuse to stop being curious. It is an excuse to prevent yourself from learning more. And I think that that's a horrible thing to inflict upon other people, because it robs folks who might otherwise have been curious and might otherwise have learned and expanded beyond their bigotry to stay small and angry and weak. And like, when we're talking about this, there's a lot of really cool and interesting things to talk about when it comes to Dahomey. Just as there are a lot of really cool and interesting things to talk about when it comes to Sparta, or the Greeks, or like any other civilization. You know, like what went into the building this society? What made it this way? Is there a good way to detect a thought-terminating cliche? A good way to detect a thought-terminating cliche is essentially to be like, well, can I continue to be curious about this? You know, is my brain taking a shortcut here to just say that bad without examining it? You know, the best way to avoid thought-terminating cliches is to continue to embrace your curiosity. You know, that's really, really important. I would say continuing to be curious, continuing to want to learn more is the way you avoid falling into thought-terminating cliches. And like Matt Walsh here is basically just, I mean, to be honest, what happened here is Matt Walsh learned just enough to be able to justify his preconceived notions about people in Africa, and now he's regurgitating it to try and spread that thought terminating cliche. Why, like in Matt Walsh's mind, why are people in Africa like this? Well, because they're black, and that's it, full stop. His thought process just stops right there. And you can't let yourself be like that. Yeah, that's just the way it is. Don't worry about it. There's nothing you can do. Exactly. These are all brick walls intellectually. And it's important to want to know where things come from, because it's how we figure out where things are going. You know, if your idea of what made China China is like, well, they really like rice and walls, and that's it. Like, you've really fallen into a pit that only curiosity can get you out of. Yeah, white people don't do violence, unga bunga. Exactly. Just like those people who defend slavery in the Bible, it's never right. Exactly, right? You can also recognize something as not being correct or not being good or not being positive, and yet still seek to understand it, right? Slavery was bad in Rome. It was bad when it was done pre-European contact in Africa, and it was bad after the transatlantic slave trade was established. You know, like, it can all be bad, but we should seek to understand it. It's how we avoid replicating those mistakes in the future. Pissed off a teacher in elementary by asking what happened to all the indigenous people. Weirdly, 2 years later, we got a fairly uncensored explanation of what happened. Well, Brutus Magnuson, the failure of the public education system cannot be overstated, really. For example, my partner in college, there was someone who was in a college course and did not know Indigenous Americans still existed. You know? Like, some people just are like, yeah, that all happened so long ago, and now they're not around anymore, teehee. Like, this is a profound failure of our public education system, but it's a result of of the system teaching not towards understanding, but teaching towards tests. It's also one of the reasons why we should have well-rounded education that incorporates the perspectives of people who are not just white, you know?
It's being not infrequently seen. Near the royal palace, there are long avenues, and when the king desires to receive an embassy with unusual pomp, gibbets are erected, and on these are hung head downward dozens of hapless slaves, there to remain, guarded by the king's soldiers, until death puts an end to their sufferings. Even before the breath has left the body, however, the vulture, in Dahomea's sacred bird, begins his work, and the screams of the sufferers, torn to pieces by the greedy birds, render the vicinity of the palace hideous.
Now, one of the things that is interesting about pre-European contact slavery is that land ownership, in the same sense as we understand it today, didn't really exist. Because there's a lot of space in Africa. As many of you have noticed, it is an entire continent. Instead, wealth tended to be judged based on the size of a household. Households could grow pretty big, right? And what that wound up meaning was that there was an incentive structure to grow your house. And that meant a typical family structure might involve like a man at the head of a house, who might have several wives, all bearing children. But it also expanded to mean slaves, because slavery did exist in Africa prior to European colonization. But the form of slavery then was different, and it tended to be one oriented towards growing your household. And so people enslaved pre-European colonization might be incorporated into the household, might be even granted after a certain period of time equal status among the other members of the house, could take on different roles. Some were even known to rise to the level of chieftain of the village. There was a like kind of a tiered system, like if you were a slave, people might discriminate against you, etc. The form of slavery was different and still not great, but it was viewed as adding to your household rather than that is your property in the same sense as like a beast of burden, you know? Yeah, the slaves weren't considered capital investment, exactly, King Kerplunk. The advent of European contact and the extraordinary incentive presented to folks that already had a strong military and already had the capacity to bring in additional human beings to their families, like the Kingdom of Dahomey, they in turn were able to leverage their pre-existing military in order to essentially set up a large weapons depot. They essentially became a gigantic military base through which Europeans could operate. And Dahomey was known for its sizable arsenal, and we know a lot about Dahomey largely because Europeans traded extensively with Dahomey. It was a big slave port. That essentially killed off the system of considering slaves as part of the family or incorporating them over time into your family. And when you then have this very big sea change, the accrual of weapons became really paramount because it gave such a huge military advantage over your enemies in the region. And Dahomey recognized that and capitalized that. And by the time Matt Walsh is using these firsthand sources, which are, the mid 1800s, early 1900s, 1904, I think he said, that period of time would have been towards the downfall of slavery, at least as dictated by the transatlantic slave trade, because of course slavery continued in different forms in Africa under European colonization. But pre-colony in this region, you still had a relatively strong military state, and you still had the concept and idea that the wealth was displayed through human beings, right? And so when we're talking about these sacrifices, right, part of the reason they're done and understanding why they're done is because if you were able to present human beings and just kill them, that was considered a huge display of wealth, right? And culturally, that practice continued up until colonization, because land wasn't viewed as like something you owned particularly. Yeah, like conspicuous consumption. Exactly, King Kerplunk. Essentially, it was like saying, we are so powerful and so wealthy and so rich, we don't even need these guys. And so that's kind of one of the explicative factors behind what Matt Walsh is describing here. But Matt Walsh isn't seeking to describe like the socioeconomic reasons why this practice may have developed. He's not seeking to understand why this is happening. Instead, he is comfortable in his ignorance, because in his ignorance, he can just say, well, it's happening because they're savage and black. That's why he's going in on this explanation, but then not bothering to explain anything more than that. It is a dereliction of intellectual curiosity in the service of just the most disgusting racism, the most base and rank possible hatreds. But let's continue.
Such gruesome accounts were an ironic outcome of European powers ending the slave trade decades earlier. Unsellable slaves were only useful as human sacrifices. But the annual mass execution festivals weren't even the most brutal event in Dahomey. According to the Sacramento Daily Union, they were, quote, far surpassed by the scenes which take place when the new monarch is crowned. 500 to 1,000 men are put to death in order to provide the deceased king with a suitable retinue in the other world. Then, blood flows in streams. On the accession of a present ruler, so great was the number of those wantonly slain that a large trench was made in the ground in which a canoe was placed. The blood of the murdered men was conducted by conduits into the trench until its quantity was sufficient to float the boat. This was the level of barbarism that defined the intra-African slave trade. The Dahomey literally sailed canoes in the blood of their slaves. They butchered thousands of slaves as an offering to their king. Slavery and barbarism were a fundamental part of their culture. Now, it's worth noting here that although
I really want to push back on that idea because, one, his source is a newspaper based out of Sacramento, and two, the idea that it's a fundamental part of their culture, when you can look at the history and the record of their culture and know that that is not the case, that this was instead a more recent development that was predicated on the massive incentives and trade done between European powers and these people. Even if you grant that it's all true, the European powers were still trading with these nations specifically because they valued the slave. They valued the slavery. And they didn't care if the people doing the enslaving on the mainland of Africa were doing stuff like this because the Europeans did not give a shit. You know, the human suffering and that was perpetrated and spread by the use of their European weapons, they didn't care. Because the Europeans made those weapons to brutalize their enemies.
Though black Africans themselves did have slaves and routinely sold slaves, they weren't big players in the transoceanic transportation of slaves. They also didn't participate in the raids on the coast of Europe that we'll address later in this episode. That's because, quite frankly, they just didn't have the technology to do that. But that's never addressed by mainstream historians, nor are...
What are you talking about? Mainstream historians have talked extensively about this. Mainstream, there are entire branches of sociology and history dealing with the history of African nations. What are you talking about? I just, maybe there's, say, an entire section at every single major university in the country dealing with, a undergraduate degree in African history. And then there are more advanced doctoral degrees in African history. The idea that this is just, no one's telling you, no one's talking about it. Yeah, I mean, I guess if you didn't bother to Google it, you could think that. I guess if you were a racist and never bothered to consider that perhaps people gave a shit about history in places that were not just, Europe. But no, he doesn't consider that because he's a racist. Again, the thought-terminating cliche terminates the thought.
Are the details on the enslavers in Dahomey. Consider, for example, Ken Burns' recent PBS documentary on the American Revolution, where he uses passive voice to creatively skirt the question of who exactly did the enslaving.
Tens of thousands were from West Africa, captured from what is now Senegal, Gambia, and Gabon, Angola, Congo, and the Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Ghana.
It would be inconvenient.
I'm sorry, you think that explains what exactly? People captured from list of countries and regions. That is an accurate description of what happened, because Ken Burns' documentary about the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War is about the Revolutionary War. It's not like if Ken Burns set out to make a history on the capture of slaves, the history of the slave trade, he would go more into detail about all of this that's happening. But that's not in fact what he's talking about. He's there to talk about the American Revolution. You know that. Why you found a documentary on the American Revolution and didn't look up a documentary about, say, the origins of the slave trade.
For propagandists like Burns to point out that the slaves were already enslaved by other Africans, mostly women, by the way, that reality makes the white guilt narrative a little less straightforward.
There is no white guilt. Okay, just real quick. For those of you that might not know this, there is no white guilt narrative. At no point in any kind of history course are you ever taught to have white guilt? Now, as a white person, might you feel guilty because maybe your ancestors participated in some of this? Yeah, maybe. But when we study history, we have to get used to some uncomfortable, ideas, uncomfortable, ideologies and facts about the human condition. Because sometimes learning things can be uncomfortable. This isn't, like, you aren't being taught to hate being white. You're just being taught about colonialism. And if you hate yourself a little bit from being the beneficiary of that colonial system, like, that's your own shit to handle. Education is about learning facts about history, learning the different narratives about history. It's not about coddling your ego. Like, get over yourself. My God.
And if they did mention it, they'd also be obliged to point out another inconvenient fact, that the horrors of Dahomey ended in 1894.
Yeah, it's a skill issue, exactly.
Because French colonizers invaded the country and burned the royal palaces. The French, who freed their slaves in 1848, built hospitals, schools, instituted social services, mostly through Catholic missionaries. In other words, they brought civilization to some of the most savage people in human history.
I mean, wait, let's be clear here. The French didn't step in to stop Dahomey because they were just such good eggs. The French weren't just, like, out of the goodness of their hearts taking over Dahomey. They had different competing claims during the scramble for Africa, and then France went to war in 1890 against Dahomey, and there was no clear victor. And then a second war happened, like, a year later, 2 years later, and that wound up with France creating, a colony there. I'm not the only one hearing Dahomey. It's literally spelled Dahomey. Maybe it's supposed to be pronounced Dahomey? Not sure. It just seems like Matt is like, a brutal war happened, and then they brought hospitals and everything was great. Except I just want to really emphasize here, everything was not great after French colonization. Hence why in the 1960s, Benin was created after the people who lived in the area formerly known as Dahomey successfully got their independence.
This year, our sponsor, Pure Talk, is celebrating President's Day by giving you great wireless service for only $25 a month. Get unlimited talk, text, and plenty of data for the cost of...
Okay. That's great.
Walsh, and you'll get 50% off your first month. Again, it's puretalk.com/Walsh to make the switch to Pure Talk. What do Snow White...
Do I need to break this up into multiple segments? I don't know. Do we need a part 2 here?
Riverboat Jack is coming to town. All the viewers gather round. Twitch and YouTube and swishy streams. All that content is bursting the seams. Politics, being and plenty more. Your sense of fashion you'll adore. So grab your stuff and hop aboard. We're going straight to Jack's Discord. Riverboat Jack.